U.S. President Donald Trump says he's terminating all discussions on trade with Canada.
Our biggest challenge as a country is becoming the most urgent.
Prime Minister Mark Carney spoke with Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum today.
I'm announcing today that the Canadian government will now match.
What happens when the neighbor you depend on most suddenly bolts the door, looks you in the eye, and says, no deal? Do you beg, fight back, or start building a new house somewhere else? That's the dilemma Canada woke up to when the United States, your trading partner and closest ally, delivered a blunt message: the talks are over. The patience has run out, and the friendship no longer guarantees favors. But was this really about economics, or was it a test of strength, loyalty, and survival in a world where politics changes faster than the seasons? For years, Canadians had been told that their deep ties with America were unshakable. The economies were interwoven, auto parts flowing across the border daily, energy deals binding pipelines to refineries, and defense cooperation creating the illusion of a permanent alliance. On paper, it looked like a marriage too complicated to end. Yet, when Washington's ambassador stepped up to the podium and declared the door was closed, the illusion shattered. There would be no more negotiations, no expanded trade pact, no handshakes under flashing cameras. Just silence and tariffs. For Ottawa, the announcement was like being punched in the gut. Politicians scrambled for explanations, insisting this was only temporary, a hiccup in diplomacy. But ordinary Canadians were not fooled. Many had already seen grocery bills creeping upward, construction projects slowing down, and exports losing their value in American markets. To them, the ambassador's words were not a shock. They were confirmation of a storm that had been building for months. The tariff trap, the roots of this fallout, ran deeper than a single press conference. Long before the announcement, American tariffs had already begun biting into Canada's economy. Steel and aluminum faced heavy penalties under the excuse of national security. Even coffee prices at the corner store were climbing, not because Brazil's beans had changed, but because the tariffs slapped on American importers trickled all the way down the chain to Canadian consumers. Imagine walking into a store, reaching for your favorite brand of coffee, and finding the price tag inflated by 50%. The beans hadn't changed. The packaging hadn't changed. The only change was a political decision hundreds of miles away. And that's how abstract policy became a daily reality in Canadian kitchens. But the tariffs weren't just about economics. They were a signal. Washington was testing how far Canada could bend before breaking. Would Ottawa accept smaller compromises just to keep trade flowing? Would industries swallow the pain in hopes of a bigger deal later? Or would Canada dare to push back? Ottawa's miscalculation behind the scenes. Canadian leaders tried to spin the tariffs as a step toward negotiations. They told citizens that the pain was temporary, that a fair compromise was coming. But in truth, Washington had little interest in compromise. The U.S. strategy was simple: force Canada into a corner, drain its leverage, and walk away stronger. When Ottawa hesitated to strike even a limited agreement, the Americans didn't blink. They had already made their calculations. The United States could live without Canadian imports far more easily than Canada could. Survive without American markets, and that imbalance became the weapon. The fallout begins, the consequences spread quickly. Factories slowed production as orders dried up. Energy producers faced higher costs to move products across the border. Families cut back on vacations, extracurricular activities, and even groceries just to balance their budgets. This wasn't some distant economic theory. It was life unfolding at kitchen tables and gas stations across the country. Meanwhile, in Washington, the narrative was one of dominance. The message was clear: America didn't need Canadian lumber, steel, or cars. Canada needed America. The math was blunt: Canada depended on the U.S. for 95% of its trade. while the US relied on Canada for only 4%. Numbers like that don't lie. The image of strength in politics. Perception often matters as much as policy. On one side of the border, American leadership projected firmness and decisiveness. On the other, Canada appeared defensive, scrambling for excuses instead of delivering solutions. Ottawa's leaders pointed south and blamed Washington for every hardship. But their words carried little weight when jobs were vanishing and exports were shrinking. The contrast could not have been sharper. One leader commanding the stage with bold declarations, the other stumbling in damage control. And Canadians' workers, families, business owners were left to pay the price. The breaking point if the tariffs weren't enough. The U.S. ambassador's tone deepened the wound. Standing before a Canadian audience, he expressed disappointment not in policies or negotiations, but in Canadians themselves. He accused them of lacking passion for the U.S.-Canada relationship, as if frustration and anger were signs of disloyalty. To Canadians, it felt like an insult. Social media erupted with backlash. Critics fired back with blunt analogies. You can't kick the dog and then blame it for growling. The sentiment was clear: Canada wasn't ungrateful. It was fed up. Yet anger alone could not repair factories or lower grocery bills. The deeper question loomed. If Ottawa couldn't steer the nation through this smaller clash, how could it survive the looming renegotiation of the much larger USMCA deal just around the corner? A nation at the crossroads, the no-deal moment marked more than the collapse of a single negotiation. It was a turning point. A crossroads where Canada had to choose whether to adapt, diversify, and stand on its own, nor risk sinking deeper into dependency. Some politicians preach diversification, building ties with Europe, Asia, and Mexico. But diversification isn't a sprint. It's a marathon. And Canada was already late to the race. The uncomfortable truth was unavoidable. For now, America held the cards. And Ottawa had little leverage left to play as the ambassador's words echoed across both nations. The stage was set for a larger showdown. The small battle was over. The real war, the renegotiation of North America's most important trade pact, was still ahead. And Canada couldn't hold its ground in the skirmish. What chance would it have in the full-scale confrontation? What happens when the small skirmish is only the warm-up and the real fight is yet to come? If Canada struggled to survive a single closed-door moment, how will it withstand the clash that could rewrite the very foundation of its economy? The stage is set for a confrontation where the stakes are 10 times higher, and the question is no longer just about tariffs. It's about survival. The illusion of diversification in the weeks following Washington's cold rejection. Ottawa scrambled. Leaders spoke confidently about diversification, promising new trade ties with Europe, Asia, and even Latin America. Speeches were filled with optimism. Headlines boasted of new partnerships. And press conferences spoke of ports, pipelines, and shipping lanes expanding across the globe. But behind the bright lights, the truth was harsher. Diversification is not a magic switch. Building new supply chains takes years, sometimes decades. Factories can't simply redirect products to Europe overnight. Nor can farmers suddenly find markets in Asia without infrastructure, logistics, and stable contracts in place. Canada was running a marathon at sprint speed, desperate to catch up, but reality doesn't bend to speeches. The weight of dependence, meanwhile, the numbers remained unforgiving. Despite Ottawa's lofty promises, the reality was that nearly 75% of Canadian exports still went south of the border. The United States was more than a partner, was the lifeline. When the U.S. shut its door, Canada's vulnerability became painfully visible. Politicians could talk about independence, but businesses still looked to American markets. Families still relied on affordable imports that flowed across that border. and investors still measured Canada's stability by its relationship with Washington. It was dependency dressed in the illusion of partnership. The ambassador's sting. U.S. ambassador's words lingered like a bruise that wouldn't fade. By accusing Canadians of lacking passion for the relationship, he struck at national pride. Was Canada nothing more than a convenient supplier, easily dismissed and blamed? Or was it a partner that deserved respect? Social media buzzed with anger, but anger doesn't pay bills. The insult hurt, but the economic reality cut deeper. Cross-border travel was down, sales of U.S. goods in Canada dipped, and Canadian exports shrank by billions. Everyday choices from buying books to selecting alcohol brands became political acts of quiet resistance. Canadians were voting with their wallets, but would that silent protest be enough to shake Washington's dominance? The calm before the storm. What Ottawa feared most was not the immediate tariff sit, was the storm gathering on the horizon. The renegotiation of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, or KUSMA as some called it, loomed just a year away. The no-deal moment had been a warning shot. The next battle would be the war. And unlike tariffs on steel or coffee, this fight would decide the very rules of North American trade. America had already revealed its strategy. Tariffs were only the opening move. Washington was prepared to push harder, demand more, and force concessions that could permanently reshape Canada's economy. And Ottawa. It was walking into this battlefield with weakened leverage, dwindling public confidence, and industries already battered by earlier blows. Leadership on trial. At the center of the storm stood Canada's leadership. Some voices urged bold action, fast-tracking projects with Europe, striking unconventional deals with Asia, or doubling down on domestic production. Others preached patience, urging Canadians to trust that Washington would eventually value the friendship again. But too many citizens? It looked less like leadership and more like panic. Ottawa appeared reactive, not proactive. Instead of setting the agenda, it was responding to America's moves, playing defense in a game where the rules were controlled by someone else, and leadership matters. As history has shown, strong leaders project confidence, rally nations, and command respect on the global stage. Weak leaders point fingers, scramble for excuses, and lose credibility. In the unfolding US-Canada clash, this difference could be the deciding factor between survival and surrender. The human cost, mid all the political chess moves. Ordinary Canadians bore the heaviest burden. Families cut back on groceries. Workers faced layoffs as factories slowed. Small businesses wondered if they could survive another year of uncertainty. For them, the question wasn't about USMCA or tariff percentages. It was about making rent, affording gas, and feeding their children. Each morning cup of coffee became a reminder that decisions made in distant boardrooms and political offices had real consequences. The economy wasn't an abstract puzzle. It was dinner tables, classrooms, and paychecks. And when Ottawa failed to deliver stability, the trust in leadership cracked. A dangerous gamblesome. Canadian officials tried to spin the crisis as a blessing in disguise, a chance to finally break free from dependence on the U.S. and build a more globalized future. On paper, it sounded inspiring. In practice, it was a gamble. Could Canada truly build an independent trade identity in time? Could it secure markets large enough to replace American demand? Could it withstand the next wave of U.S. pressure without collapsing? These were not just economic questions. They were existential. The shadow of Washington for all the talk of alternatives. The reality remained. The United States was still Canada's big brother. Geography, history, and economics tied the two nations together more tightly than speeches could unravel. And Washington knew it. That knowledge gave America power, the kind of power that could dictate terms, set conditions, and expect compliance. For Canada, the fear wasn't just about losing markets. It was about losing sovereignty over its own economic future. Would Canada stand tall and carve out its independence? Or would it be pulled deeper into America's orbit, becoming less a partner and more a dependent? The countdown to renegotiation as the months ticked closer to the USMCA renegotiation. Tension grew. Businesses braced for uncertainty. Investors grew cautious. Families tightened budgets. The no deal episode had already tested Canada's resilience, and the results were worrying. But the renegotiation would test something bigger: the nation's ability to define its own path. Failure could lock Canada into disadvantageous terms for decades, eroding industries and weakening its standing in the world. Success could mark the beginning of a new chapter, where Canada stood not as a dependent partner, but as an equal force on the global stage. But success required more than anger, more than speeches, more than temporary deals. It required leadership clear, bold, and unshakable. The question that haunts and so Canada finds itself at a crossroads. One path leads to deeper dependency, with every economic decision weighed against Washington's approval. The other path is uncertain, risky, and full of obstacles. But it holds the promise of true independence. The question haunting Canadians now is simple, yet profound. When the next battle comes, will we rise as a nation prepared to fight for our future? Will we surrender quietly to the weight of America's shadow? Only time will tell. But one thing is certain: the world is watching, and the storm is far from over.